Hello everyone. Today we're going to think a little bit more about income inequality because Gulnara is having so much fun working on these types of videos. Now, when we were talking about Okun's leaky bucket back in the 1970s, that gave us a trade-off between GDP and income inequality. And at the same time, there was this concept called the Phillips curve, and it gave us trade-offs between GDP and inflation. And so together they formed a way for thinking about policy. Now that seemed nice, but it didn't last that way. And one of the big underlying issues that we noted last time were economic dynamics. And this raises a question for me. Gulnara, when we look at economies going through stages of development, how does that lead to changes in income inequality?
This interest in 1950s gave rise to the Kuznets Curve. The Kuznets Curve gives a description of the change in income inequality as countries grow. But the devil is in the details, so let's have a chat about it. First off, everyone I hear, including Matty, pronounces Kuznets wrong. It's Kuznets, not Kuznets. But more importantly, let me give some background to Kuznets to explain. Simon Kuznets was focused on long-run dynamics and measurement. Kuznets cycles try to explain endogenous patterns in macroeconomic aggregates due to relatively long-lived patterns in demographics and infrastructural responses. The length of such cycles is generational, making them longer than typical business cycles, but shorter than the Kondratiev wave, which are more linked to life cycles of technological innovation and the loss of knowledge from the retirement of a specific generation. Furthermore, Kuznets was heavily involved in the development of GDP as a measure, and as soon as his estimates of national income were constructed in 1934, he indicated many of the concerns of using this measure to compare production or welfare through time to the US Congress. Given his recognition of the shortcomings of looking at GDP alone to understand progress and his interest in longer-term economic cycles, it was a natural shift for him to ask how economic development translated into changes in GDP and inequality. This is where the Kuznets curve comes from. In this curve, we have a linking of ideas. Economic development leads to greater GDP per person, which is reflected in rising average incomes. However, the process of development, with specialization of skills, the increasing use of capital, and the development of political and social institutions alongside this, are all factors that influence how this gain is distributed. Now, things are very complex here. There are endogeneity issues, i.e., due to the institutions determine activity and the spread of income, or do these factors determine the institutions? And many alternative hypotheses that it is difficult to rule out. So describing the stylized facts associated with the change is a good first step in figuring out what we can rule out. The curve describes a process where initial development leads to rising income inequality, while further development leads to a decline, ending in the 1960s, where observed income inequality was low. So this is a good start, but why is it happening? To understand the curve, we need to be able to explain why it occurs. There are three explanations I will put forward here. The first explanation is about technological change. The types of tasks and processes that are undertaken will change through economic development, and the transition will have implications on how income is spread through the economy. The common story is as follows. An economy starts with much of its labor in agriculture. As most people are earning a subsistence wage, earnings inequality is quite low. Development involves the use of greater tools to make agricultural products, increasing average incomes but displacing some labor from agriculture and creating a surplus pool of labor that can do other things. The makeup of potential manufacturing processes and lack of diffusion of ideas then leads to rising income inequality. However, through time, standardization in manufacturing and greater diffusion of ideas leads to declining income inequality. There are multiple ways to describe how this type of process happened through history, so I have tried to leave the process itself fairly vague. Ultimately, it is the technology and sectoral demand for labor and skills that combine to determine the way income shares evolve. At an aggregate level, thinking about labor and capital income, this is something we often call the elasticity of substitution between factors of production. At a more micro level, this refers to the relative demand and supply for tasks and skills and how these are developed, utilized, and remunerated in a given economy. The second story is that of politics and institutions. As the Industrial Revolution took place, Europe saw significant social unrest. The Jacobite revolts, the 1848 revolutions, and the following long period of industrial action all led to changes in the nature of government and the policies that were in place. The 10 and then 8-hour workday, pensions, and eventually the full-blown welfare state were all a product of public unrest with significant inequality. In this way, this explanation suggests that bargaining power, rather than technological changes, was the primary driver of this curve, with rising incomes and inequality leading to a political process that could demand change. Finally, there is the potential for measurement issues. The start of Kuznets, 1955, is focused on how income is measured, as different assumptions about this can influence the result. However, this isn't just a question of measuring things the wrong way. It's also an issue of the things we measure differing from what individuals may value. For example, if an increasing number of status goods require scarce time rather than income, then individuals will spend some of that time to get this status good rather than income. A similar result would hold for increasingly valuable leisure. In this instance, measured income or output may not rise, and inequality in it may not change, but access to this status good due to opportunity could refer to real inequalities in the opportunities individuals have. On the note of providing opportunities, I want to give Matty the chance to chat about inequality in the current day. So over to you, Matt.
Oh, thank you, Gully. I'm going to turn our faces back on, although it's actually only showing mine, so I didn't realize that would happen. And here, we'll briefly note that when you hear about capital in the 21st century, Thomas Piketty's book, a lot of it is describing this process and describing why he sees the Kuznets Curve having failed. So when we talk about these stylized facts moving on, we're in essence describing his hypothesis and talking a little bit more about what's happened there. So now I'm going to get rid of my face again, goodness, and here we are. So in the 2014 book, Thomas Piketty strongly implied that the Kuznets Curve that had been observed was largely a product of chance. Okay, he was saying there had been 2 world wars and a short period of strong population growth, and that created a situation where inequality fell and inherited wealth became less important. Now that seems very natural. He then went on to say that this is not a normal state of affairs, and the very essence of capitalism led to rising inequality and entrenched wealth going forward. So this gives a forecast that the Kuznets Curve is not something that would naturally happen, and in of itself structures of capitalism and investment and capital accumulation lead to growing inequality. Now the first thing we want to note when talking about that is that Kuznets and Piketty are both sort of wrong at a global level. So when we look at a global level, the Kuznets Curve never actually held, and more recently inequality has fallen. So inequality was rising all through the 19th and 20th century until we got right to the end. Now what was the driver of that falling global income inequality? It was the incomes of the world's poorest rising. So that's great. It's great to see that those that were in the worst situation ended up seeing some of those gains from trade as we came into the 1990s and the 2000s. Okay. But to be fair to Kuznets and Piketty, they weren't talking about global income inequality per se, because we don't set policies at a global level. They were talking about individual countries, as they viewed an individual nation as the grouping that can control how equal or unequal incomes would be. In Kuznets' view, when you got into the 60s and 70s, inequality had been falling, and that was due to some reason that was associated with the accumulation of goods and the types of technical change happening. In Piketty's view, there was a temporary shock that caused that decline, but there's a long-running trend that drives up inequality as you go along. And the rising income inequality in Anglo-Saxon countries through more modern times, he sees as describing that process and describing what has happened. So we have to ask ourselves, firstly, is this a natural consequence of capitalist development? For this to be the case, Piketty himself says that we would need an elasticity of substitution between labour and capital, that factor that Gulnara talked about before, that is greater than 1. In this case, passive income shares will naturally grow more quickly than the income earned by those who earn labour income, and as a result, you will have this situation where income inequality will rise, and it will be your capital income owners who are the ones causing it. But this just doesn't seem to be the case. In Piketty's defense, in France, you can see this in the data, but you look at these other Anglo-Saxon countries that we talk about having higher income inequality, and estimates of the elasticity of substitution in these countries are all less than 1, especially when you correct for a number of well-known biases. On top of that, we can see that interest rates are currently very, very low. So the return people are able to get from their capital in a risk-free way is currently very low. That price response really does point to a situation that doesn't support the Piketty hypothesis and doesn't point to the natural instability of capitalism that he's indicating in his book. It doesn't mean there isn't a lot of good points in the book, because there is, but that fundamental issue isn't the real driver of what's going on, as far as we can tell now. But I don't want to fully rule it out, because we have to remember that in a world with increasing automation, and where people are increasingly making services that might be more substitutable with capital, we could end up in that type of world. So it's a worthwhile hypothesis to keep in mind, but I don't think it's explained what's happened so far. So what else could be a cause? Well, there are 2 hypotheses that I think are most powerful at explaining this. And they are the ones that Gulli mentioned before. The idea of having a type of technical change, what we would call skill-biased technological change, and changes in bargaining power due to changes in policies in a lot of these countries that experienced rising income inequality. In both instances, the relative ability for low-income workers to benefit from technological innovation has been limited relative to either capital owners for bargaining or workers that have other specific skills and human capital that are currently valued. I don't like to call people low-skilled or high-skilled. Just note that there are people whose specific skills are currently valued in market processes, and as a result, if other people aren't easily able to take on those skills, they can end up made worse off. Neither of these suggest that inequality would keep rising in the same way that Piketty does, but they do suggest a potential step change, that either policy change or technological change can change the distribution of income in a country, and that we see this as a form of dynamic process. Okay, but it's not the long-run dynamic process. It's not the same as Kuznets saying it is inevitable that we see inequality fall. It's not the same as Piketty saying it is inevitable we will see inequality rise. Instead, inequality will always be something that is contingent. Now, in order to understand what has been causing it, there is a whole lot of wonderful work out there, and it's important because we need to know what has been causing it before we know what the correct policy responses may be to deal with trade-offs that we might face. But we're going to leave it here for today. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again in the future.